Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, nice to see you today.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
I want to talk about foreign policy, something that we deal with on a routine basis, but I sense a significant change in escalation in Europe, Eastern Europe, dealing with the Ukraine and also the Baltic countries, because it was announced that there will be a large shipment of weaponry to these countries. And it's hard to figure out exactly why we would need to be doing this, and who do you think's behind this? What benefit do you think the American people are going to gain from us sending a lot of equipment to Eastern Europe?
Well, back when the Baltic countries were negotiating for entry into NATO, there was an agreement made between NATO and the Russians that NATO would not permanently position heavy weaponry and significant numbers of Western troops on Baltic soil, and this would certainly, if not violate that agreement, would certainly come up against it. But the whole idea that putting 5,000 Americans as some sort of a tripwire against an 800,000 person strong Russian army, it makes absolutely no sense from a military perspective.
You know, of course, the blame is that we have to curtail Russian aggression, but like you say, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think that the statement that Putin made is at least something we should listen to. I know they dismiss, too much of our administration will just dismiss a comment like this, but just listen to what Putin said. I think that only an insane person and only in a dream can imagine that Russia would suddenly attack NATO. I think some countries are simply taking advantage of people's fears with regard to Russia. What do you think? Do you think that he's close to making a legitimate point?
Talk about a bad dream. What it seems like, here's the U.S. and NATO moving troops literally on the border with Russia, and then they're saying, we're going to wait and see what Russia does. So then if Russia moves some troops and equipment within its own country to address this obvious threat on the border, that'll be said as Russian aggression.
Yeah, you know, that's their little game they play. But, you know, there was one comment in the report that some people might say, well, maybe they're really studying this, because it said in the New York Times report, well, this hasn't been approved yet by the DOD, the Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, nor by the President. So do you think we could get this far without them knowing about it? But, you know, in their comments that the Carter and the White House hasn't agreed, they never mentioned once that Congress hasn't had an agreement either to what they're doing.
Yeah, and I wonder how the previous authorization for providing weapons and things, how that would play into it. But Congress has made itself irrelevant, so they shouldn't be surprised that no one's asking them.
Yeah, and this has been going on, of, you know, the blame game, and of course it's always saying that Russia has done this whole thing. You know, I think it's sort of ironic that, you know, in World War II, even back then when I was a lot younger, I started wondering why are we such close friends of communists? And we know a little bit about Stalin. He killed a lot of people, but strategically that was best. We had to fight Hitler. Which I could understand the motivation for that too. But this time it seems to be shifted around because right now there's a report out by Robert Perry. He goes into great detail about exactly some of the people who are involved in East Ukraine, and that it looks like, you know, some of our training might end up even helping people who aren't so nice. They're not so nice people.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you know, in Perry's article, which is a great piece, everything he writes I think is terrific. But, you know, he's been pointing out, and many others have been pointing out for a long time, that a lot of these volunteer brigades that under Kiev have been openly Nazi. They use swastikas, they use Nazi symbols. But up until now, everyone who claimed that was accused of just being pro-Putin or being crazy or conspiracy theorists. But now we have in the House of Representatives this past week, there was an amendment that prohibited U.S. training to the Azov Brigade, which is made up of people wearing, neo-Nazi uniforms.
Yeah, but I just wonder how much assurance that should give us. What about what's going on in Syria for the last couple of years? There's several factions, and we stirred up the trouble, and our position was get rid of Assad, and all of a sudden, boom, ISIS takes over, takes over Syria, and the bad people ended up with our equipment. So right now, here it is that we write the Congress. I'm glad they're interested and paid attention to this, and they say, no, we don't want any of this money going to training this group that's very, very controversial and fascist and probably Nazi. But because there's an amendment, does that really change anything? I mean, how are they going to sort it out? They didn't sort it out in Syria. How are they going to sort it out in Ukraine?
It seems to me like it's an exercise in PR management and covering up, because the U.S. policy hasn't changed at all. It's just that this one group, if you can isolate a couple of bad apples, it proves that your policy is right. And that's exactly what they're doing. And just like money is fungible, I think this training in weapons, certainly in Iraq, has proven very fungible, meaning it ends up in the hands of people we say shouldn't have it.
Well, the point I was making was it's sort of ironic, what we were doing in World War II to ally ourselves with the vicious communists, and now we're allying ourselves, it looks like, helping a government. Matter of fact, and we did help Yanukovych was thrown out. Matter of fact, the leader of the Azov Battalion was released from prison because of that. And now we're allying ourselves with this radical group. At the same time, we're painting Putin and all Russians as causing all the harm in the whole world. And I think they're dealing with their border, and I think we're a long way from our borders.
Well, I think the real fact of the matter is that U.S. policy needs people like these Nazis in Ukraine, like the extremists in Syria, because those are the ones who are willing to do anything. They have no scruples. They're willing to be violent in the extreme. And this Azov Brigade in East Ukraine, when they were operating, were completely vicious toward the civilian population. You have to have people like this to break the heads, I think, in policy.
That quote I used of Putin that said that they'd have to think it's insane to attack NATO. But I don't really think it's our position or NATO's position that we're going over there to start a war with Russia, because there's still trade going on. But they're playing with fire as far as I'm concerned. And many a war has come about by misjudging the enemy and misjudging what kind of reaction should be, and misjudging the unintended consequences, and misjudging the few people in that government or the people who might be into stirring up trouble. Let's say that there's not a total majority of fascists in West Ukraine government, but what if you just had a faction to stir things up and precipitate things? So that's what bothers me, and that's why I hate to see. I don't like us involved in any of that, but to get into this and just stir the pot. One thing that I've talked about this a little bit, because I don't have an absolute answer for this, but a couple of years ago, when this year and a half ago, when this revolution took place in Yanukovych or so on, it was almost like a switch. I mean, most people thought, well, things aren't going too badly. We can go to Russia now and we trade. The Europeans, need their gas, and always believe when you trade, you're less likely to fight. But all of a sudden, there was this switch. Do you know of one particular thing that was going through the minds of our government to say that we need a revolution there? We need to get rid of Yanukovych.
I think the U.S. has been trying to do it, and they did succeed in 2003 or 2004 with the Orange Revolution. They did the same thing, and it was successful. And I think, but the person who they threw out got back into power. He was elected again. So it's a problem that he kept getting elected. So I think the plans had always been there, and I think the U.S. had used that interim period to do a lot of training of young people in how to foment these kinds of coups. So I think it was there, and I think it was ready, and I think it was well planned. And you're right, when the switch happened,
It fits into my argument that we have two policies. You know, if we can put somebody in place and he can be our puppet and he's our friend, he's going to get a lot of money, a lot of support, and a lot of weapons and a lot of commitments. But if not, you better watch out. You may get overthrown, even if you have an election, because our goal really isn't democracy. I mean, that is a farce. Yeah. You know, when you think of how many examples around the world where, you know, we push, and there's a pretense of an election, I keep saying, why don't you make sure we have honest election in this country before we preach the gospel of honest elections overseas or democracy? And but there was obviously the economic policies. I think also one of the events that was occurring, it was the recognition of the bankruptcy of the Ukraine government, and that so often precipitates it. I don't think you can separate the economics from the military, because look at the chaos we have in Greece right now. That's all economics, and Syria, all these countries, they're poor, and they end up with military operations.
You know, there's a certain element, and you use this a lot in finance, but it's true in foreign policy. There's a certain amount of moral hazard that goes with the U.S. explicitly backing up the Baltics, because they've been the most bellicose in their anti-Russian rhetoric. But you know, I think Latvia has 5,000 men in arms, which is not even a fly. But the knowledge that the U.S. and that NATO backs up what they do emboldens them to be more provocative, whereas if they didn't have that moral hazard, they probably would have to try to find some way to reach an agreement with Russia to smooth things over.
And then if they accept us as their protector, then they come under our umbrella, and they're part of the West, and as far as I'm concerned, so often it's part of an empire that we're in charge of. And it's a more complex empire, because in the old days, the empire was the empire, but now you have these different organizations that we get control of, like NATO and the United Nations and the various organizations and trade agreements. But it's our country that's in charge, and because we have the money and we have the wealth and we have the weaponry and we have the currency. But I think that it annoys a lot of people, and it's probably going to come to an end with a bankruptcy, because we won't be able to afford this. But this is a major problem. I don't like to see this. This to me is escalation and more blame, and I think there must be a better way for the human race to react to these kind of problems that we face. But anyway, it remains a mess, and hopefully the younger generation that we've been talking to will respond in a favorable manner and refuse to accept the notion of interventionism around the world and throw our weight around, and look to the ideas of non-intervention with a willingness to defend our country if we are ever attacked. But in that area, I am encouraged, because more and more young people are starting to think this way. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.